I V M.
We are here to remind you to pay your credit card bills because paying on time is a good policy. Credit Power Play gives you a chance to win 100% cashback during the first 6 overs of both innings of any IPL match. Just pay your credit card bill and stand to win 100% cashback. Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, and today I have with me my colleagues Aditya Ramanathan and Aditya Pareek, and we're going to be talking about the controversy that was at the top of the Indian news cycle a couple of days ago, and it ran for about 24 hours at the top of the Indian news cycle. And we want to sort of try and see whether there was any merit in any of this conspiracy. What I'm talking about is the US Freedom of Navigation operation, which was carried out in the Indian exclusive economic zone of the islands of Lakshadweep. There was, like I said, a lot of furor in the media. This all started with a report in the Diplomat, from the way I understand it, and a statement put out by the US Navy, which talked about the Freedom of Navigation operation. And then all hell broke loose on Twitter if you follow any of this stuff. So we want to try and unpack this and try and not just look at what exactly happened, but also what the law says, where does each country stand, are the sort of claims by both countries, the US and India, based in law, does it even merit a conversation of this nature? And does any of this stuff have an impact on the broader bilateral relationship, or should it, apart from, like I said, the media noise? So let me begin with you, Aditya Pareek, okay? Can you just give me a bit of a background of what exactly happened? Why was this so controversial?
It's great to be here, Manoj. And as I understand it, the whole situation was just a lot of media mongering and a lot of controversy on social media alone. And these freedom of navigation operations are something that the US undertakes against a lot of countries, including its treaty allies, even security treaty allies like Japan, South Korea, and even allies against its adversaries, say, People's Republic of China, Vietnam. So it's not really something that, as was portrayed in the initial hours of the story being broken, that India was somehow singled out, or a statement was put out that was very hostile to India. Because, when you look at the actual wording of the statement, it's not very different from what US issues after conducting these FONOPs against these allied countries of its. And even the boilerplate line remained the same, that FONOPs aren't aimed at any one country in particular, but are rather supposed to be about a principle.
Okay, so the US says that we are sort of enforcing this principle of what I assume is freedom of navigation across open seas, yet it's entering India's EEZ, and this is essentially a military FONOP, right? Because it's a warship that's passing through. So what exactly is the implication of entering another country's EEZ? I mean, shouldn't you be asking for permission when you do
that? As far as the EEZ is concerned, there's no such provision under the United Nations Convention for Law of the Sea, which India is party to. It has ratified, but the US hasn't. So, according to UNCLOS, if you take that as the benchmark for international law in terms of what the rules of the road are, what's the standard protocol for navies are supposed to be. So, I don't see any provision there that says that when entering an EEZ, you have to give prior notice to a country whose EEZ you're entering. Honestly, India makes this demand kind of out of the purview of international law, and even the letter of the law in its own domestic Maritime Zones of India Act 1976. So it's honestly kind of beyond what we have written down. But let me say that India did voice some reservations when it was signing UNCLOS in 1982. At the time, India did bring up this issue But you won't find any other reference to there being notification from the government of India, say, for amendment to the Maritime Zones of India Act, which clearly states that a country should be notifying India in advance. The only exception being in UNCLOS is about hydrography survey. So that kind of an activity is very explicitly banned in UNCLOS without permission from the state, the coastal state in whose EEZ the activity is taking place. So that is the one exception. But for innocent passage, for transiting, you just don't need to tell the state whose EEZ you're transversing through.
So even under Indian law, we're not really saying that this information needs to be, that you need to take some sort of prior approval. If not approval, you need to at least inform. Right? That is, if I'm getting that right, that Indian law also does not require that.
Yeah. Yeah, a letter of the law doesn't, but government of India's position, which it expresses in like recently, the MEA press release explicitly says that our position is this. So, except for that and the 1982 reservations that were expressed during the UNCLOS signing, except for that, you won't find anywhere that there's a mention for it.
Oh, fascinating. So, Aditya, I want to come to you now. So, in that case, if the Chinese were to ever carry out a freedom of navigation operation, there would be nothing from a legal point of view that India could say that, look, you shouldn't be doing this. And likewise, anybody else. So, should we be looking at sort of clarifying that in our legislation if this is going to be, if the Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean is going to be a much more hotly contested area, Aditya?
Yeah, we could do that, and it would certainly help us clarify our position on these particular passages, like around the Lakshadweep. The thing over here is that India's objection is fundamentally not legal, not based on legality. Like Aditya Pareek very perfectly summarized, the US is not actually violating international law. It is violating an Indian legal provision that doesn't necessarily have legal standing in the international arena. The problem, of course, is that, like you pointed out, Manoj, this has the potential to set a normative precedent, right? So, the country that I think that most obviously might like to test this is not even China; it's Pakistan. The Pakistani Navy is right there, and so if Pakistan were to try something like this, and India were to block a Pakistani ship, what would India's stand be on, say, FONOPs that the United States conducts in the South China Sea? This is, by the way, one of the reasons why a lot of Indian diplomats, veteran diplomats, have been quite wary about the whole idea of freedom of navigation and American FONOPs, especially in the way they're conducted in the South China Sea. So while we have some strategic convergence with the Americans, obviously on the details of the legalities here, there is a difference between the US position and the Indian position. Now, one thing that Indians would, of course, say is that there has always been this ambiguity in UNCLOS about, does a little island or a rocky outcrop, a sandbar, how much does it constitute a feature, and how far can you draw an EEZ from that? And now that is, of course, China's contention in the South China Sea is that, well, these little features in the sea are islands, and we can claim an EEZ around this. And China has been reclaiming land, building airstrips, and so on in some of these features. So what an Indian might say is that, well, what China is doing is very different. Nobody's contesting India's sovereignty over the Lakshadweep Islands, for example. On the other hand, these rocky features in the South China Sea are contested. So India could make that claim specifically. But how, as far as what this means for India, I think it does potentially put India in a difficult position, because tomorrow, like you said, Pakistan or China are perfectly within their rights to come and test India's forbearance, when a foreign warship enters its EEZ.
Yeah, I think this is really fascinating, right? I mean, one of the sort of interesting things about, something that even I found out once this happened was that, and this was coming from a lot of commentators from the US who were talking about the fact that, look, this is something that the US has been doing regularly. It's routine. It's been doing it for the last decade or so. It was a strange choice, obviously, for a statement to be put out this time around, or I'm not even sure if a statement is put out every time around and we don't pay attention to it. But at least from what I understood from the bits and pieces of the debate that I followed, that there was a statement put out which ruffled feathers, and there was a report that was then done which also ruffled feathers. But the idea that you would talk about this is what sort of created this bad taste in the mouth in the media and on social media in India. Because if you had not spoken about it, and if you were doing this every year in, year out for the last decade or so, it wasn't really a big deal. So why talk about it? So that was the first thing, because that's when you start then entering this conversation publicly, irrespective of whether the US would have spoken about it or not. Pakistan and China would have known that these FONOPs happen. So if they at any point in time wanted to do their own, they could have done their own anyway. But now it's a matter of public record. That's the first thing. And the second thing is I want to sort of talk about that sentiment that this all gave rise to, right? There were two parts of the sentiment. The first is that, well, who gives the US the right to do this? And is this what rules-based order would mean? Because we are sort of, in some ways, linking with the US on that in this Indo-Pacific strategy. Would it mean a rules-based order which is, predicated on US interests? And the second thing would be, why would you do this to us right now, particularly when we are working with you on China in the context of the Quad? I mean, those are the two sort of really sensitive, emotional arguments that were there on Twitter. The first one sort of makes sense to me as a broader analytical discussion. The second one is obviously, like I said, it's a bit of a, hurt feelings sort of argument, right? We are now your partners. Why are you doing this to us? So I wanted to first sort of try and take both of them a little bit. So Pareek, I'll start with you.
Well, I believe that India has this concept of honor, and China has this concept of face, and the US has this concept of, for the lack of a better expression, being world police, being the cop that enforces a rules-based international order. So I think the historical baggage that has been discussed to death, I mean, on social media and in commentaries around this issue, about the 1971 sailing of the USS Enterprise and the Seventh Fleet in the Bay of Bengal. That baggage is being kind of sort of connected to this statement and this instance of a FONOP. So I think a lot of the outrage came from there, and this doesn't really, in my opinion, it doesn't really have much of an impact on the kind of progress that the Quad has made, which in my opinion is too little too late. And honestly, I don't see this degrading US India relations further, or at all rather. So that's my view.
All right. Aditya, your thoughts on firstly the idea of, is this rules-based international order that we've been talking about for at least the past couple of years now, is this an order that is predicated on American power, or is it going to be something that's going to be much more of a shared vision between these different so-called like-minded countries?
Manoj, if we were to do even the most cursory examination of American diplomatic history since the First World War, I do not know of an instance where Americans have tried to create a more expansive system that is not predicated on their interests. So that's, I mean, the short answer to that is any rules-based international order will be based on rules that Americans set, but don't necessarily follow themselves. The question for a country like India is simply, when are those rules better than, say, rules that other countries might set, for example China? And as of now, India has made the judgment, I think quite rightly, that it's easier to deal with the Americans than to deal with the Chinese. As far as why the Americans would do this, I'm completely at loss. This is one of those cases of, seems like one of those cases of extreme stupidity that you do sometimes associate with Americans, where they do something where are apparently completely unaware of the historical baggage that might accompany it, are apparently not thinking strategically. I mean, a FONOP cannot be conducted without any strategic content, right? If you were to do so, and if this was purely a legal issue, you would assume that the United States would have already ratified UNCLOS, which it hasn't. So I'm really at loss as to how the Americans can make a purely legalistic argument for conducting a FONOP.
So I want to sort of get, Aditya Pareek, I want to get your thoughts on, do you think it's, the Americans ratifying UNCLOS, now they've been talking about UNCLOS for, with regard to the Chinese now for a very long time, in the context of the South China Sea and thereafter. What sort of stops the US from actually ratifying this agreement, right? Because they've signed it, but they've not ratified it. And what stops them from, and why do you think it's time that, this Biden administration with a majority in Congress should be trying to push this?
Well, I think the US has been kind of putting this off since the 80s. Back in the Reagan era, there was at least this admission by President Reagan that the most of the provisions in the convention that were being signed, and the US has signed it but not ratified it through its legislature. So it's as far as I understand, on various occasions, the US Senate has blocked the resolution from passing. So I think the current US administration would be pretty much in line on accepting this recommendation from various policymakers around the world and some of its own functionaries that they ratify UNCLOS. But back in the 80s, even there was a clear indication that the US and the then administration and most of the subsequent administrations have agreed that most of the provisions in the convention are what is customary international law as things are. So I think it fits very well with the worldview that the US has. So it's not going to be an issue going forward, as far as I predict. My opinion is we can very well see UNCLOS getting ratified in, say, probably this administration, or if the next, maybe.
I think you'd be a very, very brave man to predict the next US administration, given that we've seen a Donald Trump presidency. So
Yeah.
I think you'd be a very brave man to do that. But anything more to add, guys?
Yeah, I will just add that, for example, back in 2019, the Americans were seriously considering conducting freedom of navigation operations in both the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage. Northwest, these are in the Arctic. The Northwest Passage runs along Canadian waters, and the Northern Sea Route along Russian waters. And Americans technically consider both of these to be international waters. So what eventually happened was that they didn't do that, because if they tried the Northern Sea Route, the Russians would have simply stopped them. And there is already a private 1988 agreement between the Canadians and the Americans, in which the Americans basically coyly agreed to ask the Canadians for permission before they use the Northwest Passage. The question, I guess, is why the United States treats other countries differently, why it doesn't have private agreements of this sort with other countries that are friendly to it. It's easy for other countries to interpret this as a signal simply because of the scale of American power. And even if the United States chooses not to enter into such private agreements with other countries, thinks it's not worth it or is not in its own interests, that's fine. But the US will have to think about the consequences of conducting such a FONOP.
Yeah, I mean, fascinating that, this all started in a manner, and I think we are in sort of agreement about this, that this was a bit of a storm in a teacup, but it still led to some interesting sort of, offshoots. One about whether it's time for the US to actually ratify UNCLOS, so that at least this criticism of it stops and it sort of acts in accordance. It has been acting in accordance, but at least this criticism stops about the US imposing freedom of navigation operations on others while still not ratifying UNCLOS. And at the same time, making this public and having a public conversation about this created this, now there's going to be much more pressure on India in case if a Pakistani vessel or a Chinese vessel were to carry out a freedom of navigation operation in an Indian EEZ. And thirdly, I think there is something about a divergence in the Indian legislation which requires for information, or at least requests that states inform it, whereas UNCLOS doesn't require that. And again, that sort of lack of congruence between those two can create ambiguity. And all of these are sort of interesting issues which have gotten lost in the last 48 to 72 hours of screaming and shouting and reviving the non-aligned lobby in India to say that we need to not be looking at the US as a partner. But yeah, thank you so much, guys. Thank you so much.
Can I just add one thing? Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just before you end, Manoj, I'll just for perspective, building on what Pareek and you have said, even as this American FONOP was going on, there was an exercise, French-led exercise that involved the Quad countries, including India, in the Bay of Bengal. So, just as a matter of perspective, the cooperation between these countries is actually going fine. And, this silly FONOP by the Americans is really not going to affect things.
Absolutely. And with that, I think we're going to call it a day. Thank you so much, Aditya Pareek and Aditya Ramanathan. This has been a fascinating conversation. Folks, for more such conversations, do tune in to All Things Policy. Thank you. The Takshashila Institution is an independent, non-partisan think tank and a school of public policy. We have education programs lasting 1 semester and 1 year that are tailored specifically for people like you. They are all online and you can take them from anywhere. Admissions are now open for our 12-week graduate certificate program in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, technology policy, and health and life sciences. Visit takshashila.org.in/courses to find out more. If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week, Siet Tires and thewholetruthfoods.com. So this week on Advertising is Dead, Varun was joined by Mansi Zaveri. She shares her experience of running a community for parents of young kids and teenagers and of hosting a podcast along the same lines. Gauri Devidayal was joined by Divya Thani on This Round is on Me. Divya works as a global editorial director with Condé Nast Traveler. They discuss the good, the bad, and the ugly of a travel writer's job. On Candid Kanan, Sid is in conversation with Adarsh Gaurav, who recently scored a BAFTA nomination for his role in the Netflix adaptation of The White Tiger. They talk about his role in the show, life pre- and post-stardom, and so much more. On Agla Station Adulthood, Ritash and Ayushi talk about the precious time and opportunities lost to the lockdown and share their post-COVID wish list. When it comes to cricket this season, we have you covered. In English, we have Edges and Sledges, which do their show live on YouTube. They look for announcements over there. And for our Hindi listeners, we have Khel Niti, hosted by Rajiv Mishra and ex-Indian cricketer Sabah Kareem. This show is live streamed on YouTube every day at 9:15. Definitely do check these out and hope to see you again next week.
Hi, I'm Zarina Poonawalla, host of the Empowering Series podcast on the IVM network. I happen to be a peak performance coach and leadership coach by profession, and I'm here to share with you productivity tools, life-altering techniques, and real-life hacks to help you achieve your maximum potential in everything you do, your relationships, professions, careers. So tune in every Monday to unleash your inner power. Be safe, be well, be empowered.